Are you ready to improve your health without the unrealistic BS? You're tuning in to Healthy Not Hungry, the podcast that believes that health begins in your mind. I'm your host, clinical nutritionist, PT, and mental health enthusiast Rach, and I'm so excited to have you join me. Hello and welcome to another episode of Healthy Not Hungry. I'm your host Rach. Thank you so much for joining us today. So today I am so excited because we are joined by the lovely Mallary Tarpley. So Mallory is an assistant professor of Practice University of Texas at Austin, where she teaches journalism classes in the Moody College of Communication and writing classes at the McComb School of Business. Her debut non-fiction book, Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery, explores the under-discussed complexities of eating disorders and recovery from them. The book is equal parts memoir and journalism, and it weaves together Mallory's own narrative with perspectives from clinicians, researchers, and others with lived experience. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mallory.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yes, me too. So I've given you a little bit of an intro there, but I always love to ask, how would you describe yourself or introduce yourself for everyone listening?
Yeah, so I am a journalism professor, as you said, but I'm also a mother of two children who are 7 and 9. I am a wife, a daughter. I am a writer, so I've always identified as a writer and journalist, and I still do a lot of writing. I write a lot about eating disorders and motherhood and grief for various media outlets, and then I also, of course, have written this book, so now I get to say I'm an author too, which has always been a lifelong dream of mine, so exciting to see that come to fruition.
Yes, congratulations on that. I'm sure that that's a very big deal. You know, it's especially as a busy mum as well and working, to be able to put that time and energy into that is absolutely amazing. So very excited to talk about that. But I wanted to ask, so when you started journalism, did you ever think that you'd discuss your own personal battles when it came to things like eating disorders?
So, I have always written about my experiences with an eating disorder, although for a long time I wrote them privately. When I was getting treated for anorexia nervosa and I was in the hospital and in residential treatment, I wrote a lot for myself privately about the eating disorder. But when I left college, I did start to write a little bit more about my experiences with anorexia. But what was interesting is that I was writing those pieces from the perspective of someone who was fully recovered, and yet I was still struggling and I was too afraid to admit that. And so sometimes those narratives felt a little bit inauthentic, and that I felt like I was writing them from this person or this recovered woman who I was supposed to be, and I was too afraid to really go deep into the difficulties that I still was experiencing. And so with this book, Slip, I've really been trying to just write as honestly as I can about just how slips do happen in eating disorder recovery. And I often say that I am someone who lives in the middle place, which is this name I've given to this liminal space between acute sickness and full recovery. And it's a place where slips do sometimes happen, but progress is always possible. And so my writing has really changed since I have written more authentically and honestly about where I'm really at in my recovery.
Yeah, cool. It's good that you've been able to come to a place where you can be so vulnerable. I imagine too, sometimes when you were writing from a place of recovery, even though you felt like you weren't there, maybe it was like the aspiration of kind of where you wanted to be too.
Yes, exactly. Because I consider myself to be in recovery now, and I'm so much better than I ever imagined I was. But for so long, I really had this perfectionistic ideal of the full recovery, and I did want to try to attain that. But at the same time, I didn't really know what full recovery actually meant. And even the eating disorder field has not yet come to a general consensus definition of what full recovery means. There are probably as many definitions of full recovery as there are studies about it. So I think in parts it was aspirational, and it was also because I did feel shame around not being fully recovered with a capital F and R. And so I felt like I really needed to hide my struggles because of that stigma and shame.
Yeah, of course. That makes total sense. It's interesting because I know I've done a lot of study in the mental health area, and I'm not sure if it's the same in the States, but in Australia, they've redefined what they define as recovery for mental health. So recovery is now defined as not actually getting over something, but it's learning to live alongside the mental health so that you are still reaching for goals and, you know, having a meaningful life with this mental illness intact. And I guess it's interesting because I wonder if the same thing will kind of come about in the eating disorder community, where it's kind of like you're never fully actually over it and recovered, but it's learning to live that meaningful life and moving forward while still working through it.
Yeah, that is so beautiful. My hope is that we can adopt more of that mentality in the States. I think
Yeah.
that in some fields we have, like in the addiction space, it is more commonplace to say that you're in recovery or that you're recovering. And so it suggests that it's something that's ongoing that you may have to contend with. But certainly when it comes to eating disorders, the language we use to describe recovery does tend to be more black and white. And we talk more in terms of acute sickness and full recovery. And yet I think that there is this semantic expanse in between. There's sort of this like widening of vocabulary that I think needs to happen so that people have more words to actually describe what their recovery looks like and what it means to them.
Yeah, definitely. And it's hard too, because I know going from someone who's had issues with body dysmorphia in the past, I mean, I say in the past, but I don't think it's something you ever fully get over. Like, I think it's a constant work in progress, and you go through seasons and stages where you're doing really well with it, and then something can come up and really get in the way of it, and you have to, work hard again to get back to that level spot. So I think it would be cool if they could adopt more of that recovery orientated approach where it is a constant work in progress, I guess.
Yes, I love that. And to your point about body dysmorphia, I think that that's so common. And I remember when I was doing research for the book, I came across this term called normative discontent. And it's essentially just this clunky term to describe the fact that research shows that the majority of men and women in our society have some level of discontent with their bodies. And so that's the society that we're recovering into. So to recover and think we're never going to have a bad body image day or feel bad about what our bodies look like or what we're putting into our bodies is kind of unrealistic, unfortunately, when you consider the backdrop of our collective society.
Definitely. I did a podcast ages ago to do with this, and I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but it was something like 80 something percent of females experience that. Like huge numbers. And even in the men, it was somewhere in like the 60%. Like it was a bit bigger than you would have originally assumed.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we know that these issues affect men as well. And I think that's important to highlight because I think so often eating disorders in particular are kind of just dismissed as white teenage girl issues when in fact we know that they do not discriminate.
No, they never do. So I wanted to jump back a bit, if you don't mind. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your journey with us of like where I guess it began and kind of to where you're at now, if that's all right?
Yes. So I feel like I could talk about this for hours, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version, which
Thank
is
you.
that when I was 8 years old, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I really held on to hope that she was going to be okay. That was really the narrative that my family and I adopted. But the cancer spread to her bone marrow, her liver, her brain, and she eventually passed away when I was 11 and when she was 40. And I remember just putting on this happy face. I went to school the next day. I read the eulogy at her funeral and was perfectly composed and really just felt like I needed to try to pick up the pieces and move on because that was always the way that we had handled her illness. But the more that time passed, the farther I felt from my mother. And I found myself wanting to stop time, wanting to stay small because I thought maybe if I stay the same size I was when my mother was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And at the same time, I was taking a health class where we were learning about quote unquote good foods and bad foods. And I was learning that we could change the way our bodies look depending on what we ate. And so I began to restrict my food intake. And it really was never about being skinny, but really about trying to stay small and safe in the aftermath of this tragedy. And so I ended up very quickly developing an eating disorder. I was hospitalized on 5 separate occasions and was also in residential treatment for a year and a half. This was all during my teenage years. So was in treatment for quite a while. And residential treatment in particular was really helpful in terms of just enabling me to see that I was so much more than my eating disorder because I had really come to define myself by my disorder and couldn't really see outside of that. And so part of recovery was learning to reclaim my own identity and learning to see the eating disorder not as the solution, but really as the problem. And so I was in a period after leaving residential treatment of really solid recovery for about 2 years, but found that I was in college, freshman year, beginning to kind of get some disordered thoughts that were creeping back in. And this was partly because I was just overwhelmed by being in college. My father had told me he was getting remarried. I was concerned about the freshman 15, which research shows is really a myth. But there were all these factors that were really making these eating disorder thoughts creep back in. And it got to the point where I really could not silence them. So freshman year of college, I fell into this very vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting. And that cycle lasted for about 10 years. And I really thought during that time that I should have been better. And I was ashamed to ask for help because I thought, well, I was in treatment for so long. Why am I struggling now? And I felt like I was failing at anorexia and full recovery. And it wasn't until my mid-20s that I began to really reframe my thinking around recovery. And rather than saying, okay, I had a slip, might as well just sort of turn that into a slide, right? Like I binge ate this morning, so might as well restrict the whole rest of the day. I began to think, what if I looked at slips not as grounds for failure, but really opportunities for progress? And what if I normalize them more as being part of the recovery process? And so I began to do that. And at the same time, met my partner, who's now my husband. And so those two factors, both the middle place, meeting my husband, really enabled me to get out of that vicious cycle and to really make meaningful progress forward. Over the past 10 to 15 years, I've really thought about recovery more in terms of the middle place. And I've thought about how there really aren't many books or any books that I know of that really explore this. And so for me, it was really meaningful to think, how do I share my own story, but also think about other people who may be in this middle place. And so I ended up surveying over 700 people from 44 countries, and I interviewed about 175 surveys and researchers. And what was so fascinating is that so many people said, I'm in the middle place too, but I didn't know how to really describe it. So I think for me, that's been just really eye-opening to see how many people are in this space and how under-discussed it is.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thank you for sharing that. Firstly, I'm so sorry about your mum. That's such a tough thing to go through as a little girl. Yeah, my heart really goes out to you. I have a little girl myself, and the thoughts of her going through that is just heartbreaking. But yeah, wow, what an absolute journey you've been on. And it's incredible that you're able to turn it into something to connect other people and, normalize that middle place where a lot of people find themselves, because I think that's the problem. There's, you're right, there's people who go through this treatment and they're like, okay, I feel better, but then they do start to slip and they don't know what to do with it, because I think it would be hard because you're like, but I have recovered before, like, it's different though. And, like for you, like you're in a totally different phase of life. You're in college, like you said, other things were happening at home. Like it's really, there's no manual for life, So I think it makes sense that even though can get to a place of recovery, it can change so quickly because everything else changes too, and it's a new experience for us.
Yes, exactly. And I think for me, I never really had conversations in treatment about the possibility of slips and relapse. And I think that that is more prevalent now in treatment centers. So that's great just to see how care has evolved. But I still think that that word is stigmatized. I even remember when I was interviewing a clinician and I told her the title of the book, she said, well, I wouldn't title it that because that word slip has a really negative connotation. And I said, well, that's precisely the point. I want to remove that negative connotation and just express the fact that these slips happen. And yes, they're so hard to navigate. But when you think about that word slip, it suggests some sort of movement because you can't slip if you're standing still. So I like to think about it more in a positive light.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can definitely turn it around to that. It's interesting. I had a client years back, and I know like she was only a young teenager, but I know for her that she was scared of admitting that she'd slipped because of how it had impacted her family when she was in treatment. And for her, it was really scary to just even let them know. Like she almost wanted to silently struggle because she was so worried about worrying other people. And it's like that slip can mean so many different things to different people too. And, I think trying to turn it into a positive of its movement, it's adapting, it's, learning how to come out of it. Like it's huge.
Yes, yeah. And to your point, I think it's really important just for caretakers to be aware of that as well and loved ones, because I think it can be easy to just become alarmist and to think, oh my gosh, my daughter or my partner has slipped. So that's horrible. Or that means that they're going to get sick right away again. And I think that being able to just trust that this person will, with your support, be able to get back up again is really important, because I think sometimes when people react in this very alarmist way, it can make the person who's struggling feel like they can't then go to that person when they slip. And we know that the more we keep our slips secretive, the more stuck we get. And so I think it's really important to know that we need to be able to talk to people about slips, and for people on the receiving end to say, okay, slips are part of the process. I'm going to try to help this person through them rather than blaming them or stigmatizing them.
Yeah, definitely. It's having that awareness. I know, like, I've got other relationships in life where people are going through similar battles, and it's really hard to know how to be there for someone. Once again, just like it's hard to go through it and no one tells you how to handle it. As supporting someone, it can be really tough to know, how are you going to raise them up and be there for them rather than bring them back down and enable them. Like, it's such a tricky space.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah. I did want to ask, so in your book, what does it kind of cover? Like, obviously we've got the middle and the slip context, but can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. Each chapter, it's interesting. I take a split chapter approach. So the first half of every chapter is very personal, and it's going through my own experiences with my eating disorder and getting diagnosed, being hospitalized and what that was like, and then sort of the relapse in college, and then arriving at this idea of the middle place. Then it moves through toward meeting my husband, getting pregnant, and what that was like, and the challenges I had postpartum with regard to my eating disorder. And then it moves through to the present day, looking at motherhood. And as part of that chapter, I'm also looking at genetics. So in the second half of each chapter, I'm kind of getting into more of the science and the reporting and the interviews that I did. And each chapter is unified by a central theme. So the chapter, for instance, about motherhood, in the first half, it's looking at my experiences as a mom. And in the second half, it's looking at what are the genetic risks if you're a mom who has kids. What does that actually mean and look like? And so I think that structure really enabled me to go deep into my own personal story, but then also to go deep into a lot of the research and reporting that I did. And that research and reporting was really revelatory because it enabled me to really learn a lot more about the neurobiology of eating disorders and how they affect the brain. So I weave a lot of that into there in a very accessible way. And then looking at genetics, looking at the evolution of treatment. So I was in treatment in the late 90s. How has it evolved since then? So I really, alongside my own story, am bringing in lots of other perspectives from folks with lived experience of all different eating disorders, and then bringing in sort of that science and research. So you can imagine from a structural standpoint and a writing standpoint, it was a big lift just in terms of figuring out how do I weave all of this together in a way that doesn't give readers whiplash, and how do I make the science and the research really accessible to people who don't understand really much about eating disorders. But it was a real gift to be able to bring all of that together. And I think for me, doing all of that additional reporting and research was so important because in many ways I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder, in that I'm white, I live in a smaller body, I'm female, I'm middle to upper class, and I didn't want this to just be my story alone. I really wanted to be able to bring in perspectives from people of all different races and ethnicities and genders and ages, and people struggling with all different types of eating disorders and different body sizes. So that broadened my own scope of understanding around eating disorders, but I hope that it also will open up more points of relatability for readers.
Yeah, it sounds extremely comprehensive, which is really cool because it sounds like it's that book that anyone who is struggling in some kind of form can pick up and be like, there is something I can relate to and connect to in this.
Yes,
Which
that's my
is,
hope.
I think, that connection point to not feel alone and not feel like you're stuck in this struggle by yourself is really, really powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the book that I wish that I had had when I was in the earlier stages of my recovery and when
Yeah.
I was relapsing. And so it really is my hope that the book helps people to feel seen and heard, because I think a lot of people who live in the middle place have not really felt like they've been visible. And so I think being able to give them a voice and help them to feel like their story matters has been a real motivating factor for me as a writer.
Definitely. Like you're coming from 2 points here, aren't you? Like as a writer, that would be very motivating. But as someone with lived experience yourself, it's probably really powerful to hear where other people have come from and feel like you can shine the light on that. Like that's huge.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I love sort of thinking about it, both in terms of craft as a writer, but also in terms of just my own lived experience and how those two really influence my thinking around the book.
Yeah, definitely. I think for anyone who's been through some form of lived experience, whether it's eating disorder related or something completely different, when you come to a point of power of realizing that something can be done to help others so that they don't feel so hopeless through it like you did, like that's really huge. It's, being able to, it's almost healing in itself, isn't it? Being able to walk out of a really tough situation and be like, I can do something not only to help myself, but can hopefully help someone that was younger me who could have really used that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so that feels like a gift. I keep thinking about how the book will soon be out, and I keep referring to it as my book, but really I think about how once it's published, it's your book, it's everyone's book, right? I want it to sort of be this collective resource for people who really need a book that just looks at the nuances of recovery and really dives deep into those without glossing over hard truths.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I think you're right. That is a gift, and it's exciting that people can open it and feel like it's their book and be like, okay, this is for me, this is to help me, it's not someone else's. And yeah, even that in itself is really lovely.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree.
So, for anyone listening, like who might be thinking, oh, okay, this is really speaking to me, and maybe I'm also stuck in the middle place, although I didn't even realize it was called the middle place. Reading the book is obviously when it comes out, which will be soon, we'll talk about that in a minute. Do you have any tips of where you think from your experience, if this was you when you were in college, what advice would you give yourself to begin, I guess?
Yeah, so I think that it is so easy to focus on all of our mistakes, all of our slips, all of our lapses, and that can really feel detrimental after a while. And I think it can make us feel like we just aren't able to move forward. And so rather than think in terms of full recovery, even though I think for some people full recovery can be possible, for me, I tend to think more along the lines of more recovery. So I think, okay, how am I going to think about achieving more recovery today? Maybe some days it's only 1%. Maybe other days it's more like 6%, right? Maybe it's hard to quantify. But I think that rather than only focusing on slips, we also need to focus on any choice that we make in service of recovery, because any choice like that is worthy of celebration. And I think that we often tend to overlook that fact and we focus so much on the negative. And I think part of recovery is really taking a more strength-based approach as opposed to a deficit approach, and thinking about what are our strengths? What strengths have we exhibited today? What choices have we made in service of recovery? And how can we try to make more of those choices moving forward? Because I think more recovery day by day can ultimately lead to a fuller expression of it. So I wish I had known that when I was really struggling. And I hope that that gives some listeners comfort.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's wonderful advice. It's true though. Like it's like with anything in life. You can always focus on your downfalls or where you've struggled or where you've taken a negative turn, or you can look at, like you said, a strengths-based approach and be like, but you know what, I did do this or I did do that. I think even the power of, so many people disregard it, but the fact that you get up every day and you take that effort and you show up to work or you show up for your kids or whatever it is that you show up for, like so many people, don't regard that as a strength, but it really is. And I think, yeah, in life, we've got to be our big cheerleaders and put some more strengths-based approach and be proud of ourselves for the things we are doing rather than just constantly focusing on where we're falling short.
Yes, exactly. I think that that's so important. And I think also being able to talk about our slips with people who we trust is incredibly important as well. And recognizing that we don't have to struggle in silence, because I thought for so long that I did. And that was just really devastating in a lot of ways, because I just felt like I couldn't really tell anyone. And so I just have a lot of empathy for my younger self, because I wish that I'd known it was okay to ask for help, even though I'd been in treatment, even though I had previously been in a really solid place with my recovery. I think sometimes that's when it's hardest to ask for help, when we have relapsed after a year or two or three or however many of being in more solid recovery.
Yeah, of course, it's a very tricky space to be vulnerable enough to open up and ask for that help. So I can appreciate that would be very, very tricky. So for anyone listening, as we mentioned, the book comes out very soon. Can you tell us more about that, where people can find it, where they can find you, and obviously about the book in itself?
Yes, definitely. So the book, it's titled Slip, and it will be out on August 5th, but you can pre-order it wherever you buy books. So it's available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble's website. Your local independent bookstore probably has it on their website as well. So pre-orders really help authors, because they help retailers determine how many copies to stock. And so if people are planning to buy it, might as well pre-order it. But I am also going on a book tour, and I'm posting updates on my weekly Substack newsletter, which is just my first name, Mallory, Mallary.substack.com. So you can subscribe there for free, just for updates about the book. And I'm also pretty active on Instagram, which is just my full name, Mallary Tarpley.
Beautiful. We'll link it in the show notes too. How exciting. And for our Aussie listeners, Amazon would probably be the best place to order. Will they do international?
Yes, I believe so. I have had some inquiries from people in Australia. And so,
Okay,
yes, it is
great.
available. It will be in audiobook form, Kindle, and hardcover. So I know of those three options, you should be able to find at least one way of accessing the book.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mallory, and for being so vulnerable and open. I appreciate it so much. I know that it's a tough thing to open up for to someone who you've just met. So I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for your great questions. This was a lovely conversation.
No, it was. And all the best with the book. I can't wait to see where it goes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for tuning in and joining us once again. If you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and leave a review on your favorite podcast streaming site, or share with someone who you think could benefit from this episode. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media at Healthy Not Hungry or Healthy Not Hungry Podcast.